Story 1. Forest Stalker. I'm an avid hiker, and I was exploring Utah on a cross-country trip I took after breaking up with the woman I thought would be my fiancée. Long story short, I caught her fooling around with one of my closest friends, a complete betrayal on both sides. I was 31 at the time. Utah was one of the states I was most excited to pass through, as it boasts some of the most breathtaking forests every hiker dreams of exploring. I chose Wayzata National Forest as my destination because I'd heard great things about it, and one of its best features was the many secluded areas that I could easily access. Since I prefer hiking alone, busy trails filled with people are just not my thing. I picked an unmarked area of the forest and drove as far down a narrow access road as I could. After parking, I stepped out of my car and took in my surroundings. I geared up and checked my phone. No service, just the way I like it. I made a mental note of my starting point and began my trek. I know that hiking alone in uncharted territory can be dangerous, but I simply enjoy not following a preset trail. I always download a digital map of the area I plan to explore. Many people don't realize that your phone's GPS still works without service. I know what you're probably thinking, but no, I didn't get lost. I wish I could tell you that getting lost was the story, but what happened to me is something I'm still trying to understand. My destination was a lookout point at the summit of the mountain, about 3 or 4 miles away. The terrain was quite challenging, so I was only making about 1.5 miles per hour. About an hour into my hike, it began to rain lightly. Annoyed, since hiking in the rain is a huge pet peeve of mine, I decided not to continue and began retracing my steps. Eventually, I spotted my car in the distance and felt relieved that this failed outing was almost over. But when I reached my vehicle, I was met with a horrifying sight. All 4 tires had been slashed. I felt fear start to set in immediately. There was no way that all 4 tires could have been punctured by chance. This was deliberate. I whipped my head around, scanning the forest in every direction, but saw nothing. I listened as carefully as I could, but any sound I might have detected was drowned out by the patter of raindrops on leaves and brush. I weighed my options. Without cell service, I was basically stuck. I needed to get a signal to call for help, but as far as I remembered, I'd lost service over 20 miles down the access road. Walking back to civilization seemed like a grueling option, so I needed to find higher ground. Luckily, the destination I'd originally sought was just that. I decided to take a chance, as I didn't feel safe walking 20 miles down an open road, and without another thought, I turned back into the woods and resumed my route. About halfway to the summit, I picked up on a faint rustling behind me, maybe 40 yards away, which seemed to start and stop in sync with my movements. I didn't want to turn around, so I simply quickened my pace, confident that I was probably a faster hiker than whoever, or whatever, might be following me. The sun was beginning to set, casting an eerie shadow over the forest, and with the rain still falling, my nerves started to get the better of me. After putting some distance between myself and the possible follower, I casually glanced over my shoulder. I saw nothing, but I knew someone could be hiding behind any of the countless trees. Finally, I reached the peak. By some miracle, there was cell service up there. I didn't waste a second, not even pausing to admire the view. I called the police, explaining exactly where my car was and what had happened, including my suspicion that I was being stalked. I also told the operator that I had AAA. I hung up, relieved that someone now knew my whereabouts. However, there was still a glaring problem. I had to navigate back through the forest before it was completely dark, all while somehow avoiding whoever was stalking me. I couldn't simply march in a straight line back. That would be asking for trouble. After a moment of thought, I concluded that I'd have to make my way back in a semicircular path to my car, hoping to avoid any traps. I recalled someone mentioning that walking parallel to the cliff for a while before re-entering the woods at a different angle might help. Since I hadn't really analyzed that part of the forest, I pulled up the map on my phone and prayed that my navigation skills wouldn't let me down. For a while, everything went smoothly. I didn't hear any unusual sounds, either behind or in front of me. But perhaps I spoke too soon. Not 30 seconds later, I heard a twig snap from my left. I turned to look but saw nothing, and a few minutes later, I heard another sound, this time coming directly from behind me. My blood ran cold when it dawned on me that there were multiple people out there. I picked up the pace again, eventually settling into a light jog, as if the situation wasn't terrifying enough already. Then, something happened that sent my panic level from a 5 to a 10. I stumbled upon a makeshift campsite, literally tucked away in the woods, about a dozen logs arranged in a circle around a campfire, evidence that someone had been there recently. I jogged around it and continued on, frequently glancing behind me. A few minutes later, I heard something coming from my right. I turned quickly and barely caught sight of a foot disappearing behind a tree. That was it for me. My light jog instantly turned into a full-on sprint through the woods. I didn't care how loud I was being, I just needed to get out of that forest. As I ran, the sounds around me grew louder, and it became clear that I was being chased. There was no attempt to hide their presence anymore. I kept running, too afraid to look back. Eventually, I couldn't resist and glanced over my shoulder, counting at least 6 people, all dressed in white, charging toward me. I continued running, knowing my car wasn't far away. The next few minutes were the most terrifying of my life. Imagine being overwhelmed with exhaustion while the threat of death looms over you. I simply couldn't slow down, my life literally depended on it. Finally, I saw my car in the distance, and right behind it was a police officer. I reached his car and nearly keeled over, almost throwing up before he even had a chance to speak. When I turned around, the people who had been chasing me were nowhere to be seen. The officer told me that he had already called AAA, which I was extremely thankful for. I gave him a full report, and what he told me was chilling. Apparently, Utah has the largest population of Mormons in the country, and it's uncommon to encounter woods folk in unmarked forests. He explained that the specific forest I was exploring had a very rich history, especially concerning woods cults and various religious groups. According to him, I had probably stumbled upon one such group, and it was foolish of me to explore a random part of the woods. In all honesty, what that officer told me years ago might indeed have been true. I still can't wrap my head around it. If they were angry that I was intruding on their land, why wouldn't they simply warn me instead of stalking and chasing me through the woods, especially after slashing my tires? This experience is something I think about all the time. Story 2. Wailing Woods. I'm not going to call myself an expert hiker, but I've been passionate about hiking for several decades now. I've covered most of the major trails in America and visited over 75% of this beautiful country's national parks. Because of that, I had to come up with new ways to keep things exciting. Recently, I picked up a hobby of scouring Google Maps for lesser-known forests and exploring them. It's a bit unconventional, but I believe the thrill is worth the risk of getting lost. At least, that's what I thought until I did. I carry a pack of homemade route marking stickers that I periodically stick on trees so I won't lose my way. As I pass each one, I remove it to avoid leaving any litter behind. I'm surprised more people haven't caught on to this tip. It practically makes getting lost in a forest impossible. This time, I decided to take on a slightly more daunting challenge, exploring Dudley Town Forest in Connecticut. If you don't know, the whole town has been abandoned since the 1800s, and there are plenty of eerie stories about strange happenings there. You should research the place if you're into that sort of thing, but I'm not superstitious, and I don't buy into ghost stories. Technically, the forest is off limits to the public, but that hasn't stopped me before, and I knew I was unlikely to run into anyone there. Plus, being from New England, the drive wasn't too bad. I entered the woods around noon so I could finish my hike before sunset. My first impression of the forest was honestly pretty unsettling. I had heard it was dead silent there, and I was surprised to find that it really was. You don't appreciate all the sounds of the forest until they suddenly disappear. Imagine closing your eyes in a quiet room where all you can hear is your breathing. I had experienced similar silence in other animal-free forests before. I kept walking and placing my stickers as I went, trying to shake off the eerie feeling the woods were giving me. I kept expecting to spot an animal or some sign of life, but nothing happened. After a while, I even hoped to encounter another person, just because I felt so unsettled. Then, just as I started feeling a bit more at ease, I picked up on a sound that sent the uneasiness rushing back. It was a wailing, moaning noise, the kind you might imagine coming from a wounded animal. That's the best way I can describe it, and I still have trouble explaining it to this day. It was especially creepy because it was the only sound in the entire forest. I paused and listened, trying to figure out what it could be. Sure, it might have been the wind whistling, but there was no wind, so that didn't make sense. I decided it was most likely a wounded animal, even though I doubted it, and I walked away until the sound faded. You might wonder why I didn't just turn around and leave right then. I wish I had an answer for that, but I told myself that if one more creepy thing happened, that would be it for me. As I continued, I started to think about how a wounded animal could even exist in a forest like this. Was someone hunting here? I couldn't have missed a gunshot, right? Maybe the hunter had already taken the shot, or worse, neglected to end the animal's misery. It was hard to imagine, and all these thoughts swirled in my head. Then I stumbled upon something on a tree right in front of me, genuine carvings. It sounds cliché, but I'm completely serious. The carvings were in symbols, not letters, just random slashes and missing bits of bark. Looking around, I noticed several neighboring trees covered in the same marks. That was it for me. I immediately turned around and started walking back, removing my trail markers as I went. Being naturally curious, I hesitated for a moment, thinking, screw this, and followed my trail markers a little further before I saw something in the distance that I hadn't noticed before. It looked like a bear's den or, at least, a cave of some sort. I stopped, confused. I know myself well enough to say there was absolutely no chance I would have missed a bear's den, and that's when it hit me, my trail markers should have been placed at shoulder height, not waist level. My blood ran cold. I turned around and began sprinting back the way I came, constantly glancing over my shoulder. How could I have been so careless? Someone had moved my stickers in an attempt to lure me toward that cave. But how could someone have been tracking me this entire time? I didn't have time to think it all through, I was focused on getting the hell out of that forest. The problem was, without those trail markers, I was as good as lost. I kept running, not even trying to be quiet because it would have been pointless. The forest was dead silent except for the noise I was making. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and pulled out my phone, praying for a signal. By some miracle, I got a bar. I found my parked car's location on the map and figured out which direction to head in. I wasn't far from my car, but just as quickly as the signal appeared, it dropped again. It didn't matter, though, I knew where I was going. That's when the wailing started up again, only this time it was twice as loud. I ran faster than I ever had before, even though I couldn't shake the feeling the sound was coming right from behind me. Every time I turned to look, I saw nothing. After the worst 10 minutes of my life, I finally reached the edge of the forest and the wailing stopped abruptly. I jumped in my car and sped off before whoever had been chasing me could catch up. That day completely ruined hiking for me. Here's my rational explanation: some hermit or woods freak lives in those forests and noticed me before I even did. For whatever reason, he tracked me and tampered with my trail markers, trying to lure me toward that cave. I suspect he had a whistle or something that produced that wailing noise, which is why it stopped so suddenly once he realized he wasn't going to catch me. I know there are gaps in that explanation, like how could someone blow through a whistle for that long while running at full speed? I'm open to anyone suggesting alternative explanations. Maybe there's a reason that forest is off limits to civilians. Story 3. Reservoir Curse. When I was younger, my childhood home was the perfect spot for squad hangouts, and there were several reasons for that. My dad had a huge man cave in the basement with an almost unlimited supply of beer, and my parents usually let us drink there while mostly leaving us to our own devices. I lived on a pretty large piece of land, and my house was bordered by a decent-sized wood. If you walked through the trees behind my house, you'd eventually find a dirt road, and on the other side of that road was the reservoir, a place that captured my heart since I was a kid. I cut countless holes in the reservoir fence, so many that the Water Commission eventually stopped fixing them, because it's illegal for civilians to trespass on reservoir property. As a kid, that place was my sanctuary. I went there to smoke, to escape from my parents, to swim, and to think. It truly was a beautiful place and probably the only thing I miss from that time in my life. One day, my friends and I were playing a few rounds of pool in my basement while obnoxious EDM music blasted in the background when my friend Tyler came up with the brilliant idea to take a hike through the woods to the reservoir. We were all bored, and since the sun hadn't set yet, it wouldn't be a nightmare to find our way there. There were 5 of us in total, me, Tyler, Rob, Jared, and Elias. I can't remember all the details, but I'm pretty sure that Rob and Elias grabbed some beers for the trip, as they were the drinkers in our group. I had already had a few drinks, so I made sure not to overdo it. The reservoir was huge, so even after cutting through the fence, we still had a bit of walking ahead of us. The woods were still a little muddy from the earlier rain, but by then we were fully committed to our plan. There was a cliff on the near side where we usually hung out, so that's where we headed that night. After a while, though, we decided to keep walking and hang out on the far side of the reservoir. To get there, we first had to walk along the near side until we reached the end where we could cut across, and then we could stroll along the far side until we found a really smooth spot that we used to call the beach. After about 20 minutes of walking, we finally found ourselves on the far side of the reservoir. Then things took a strange turn. Elias raised his hand and pointed into the distance. Remember, we were on the far side of the oval-shaped reservoir, but we hadn't reached the beach yet. Elias was pointing to our right, and we soon realized that something was moving toward the reservoir on our side, though much farther down. The 5 of us fell silent and watched as a dark figure slowly made its way toward the water. We felt a mix of excitement and fear because it meant we might have a close encounter, something we usually welcomed. As the figure came closer, we saw that it was dragging something behind it. The farther it moved, the more we could tell that it was a large, black garbage bag, and the way it moved slowly suggested it had something heavy inside. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but there have been a few bodies found in that reservoir over the years, so in that moment, we quickly assumed the worst. We stopped smiling and talking, simply staring quietly at the figure dragging what we guessed was a body toward the water's edge. After reaching the water, the figure knelt down over the bag for a few minutes. From our distance, we couldn't tell exactly what he was doing. We decided that was a good time to leave since he was distracted. Before we could get away, however, Tyler spotted something else that made us freeze. 3 more figures emerged from the woods, 2 dragging bags and 1 carrying a kayak over his head. I honestly started to feel sick. I lived only 10 minutes from one of the most crime-ridden towns in America, so if this turned out to be gang-related, it would make sense. The first man we saw got into the kayak while the other 3 helped load one of the bags onto his lap. He then paddled out to the middle of the reservoir, and we watched as the garbage bag sank beneath the water's surface. He repeated this process twice more before, like something out of a movie. My phone suddenly rang. That annoying ringtone cut through the silence like a razor, and my nervous self couldn't silence it fast enough. All 4 men froze and turned to look in our direction, and that was when we ran, and just like that, the sanctuary of my backyard reservoir was gone forever. Rob shot a glance over his shoulder and yelled that they were following us. It was the scariest moment of my life. Running through a forest is incredibly difficult, and when combined with the fear of being chased, it's even worse. We ran all the way down the bank, cut across, and made our way through the woods on the near side back to the hole in the fence. I don't know if it was the nerves, the alcohol, or both, but to save my life, I couldn't remember where the damn hole was. I reached the fence first, with my friends close behind, and they began to panic as they saw me frantically tracing the fence, searching for a hole that could be anywhere. We ran along the fence, and I was ready to give up when Rob pointed ahead and yelled that the hole was just a few feet away. We all bounded for it, and as I helped Tyler through, we heard the sound of a tree branch being stepped on not far behind us. I knew they were closing in. We didn't stop running. We sprinted through the woods all the way back to my backyard, and when we finally made it, we were relieved to be safe. That's when Elias called the police. We told them what had happened, and they said they would send a squad car to my house immediately. I knew I was going to get in trouble for trespassing, but at that point, I didn't care. My friends were just relieved to be safe, though I still felt very uneasy. The path from the reservoir to my house wasn't very long, and they could have easily followed the tracks we left behind on the trail. Eventually, the police arrived and listened to our story. They searched my property for any signs that we had been followed, and my stomach dropped when they actually found a set of muddy footprints leading to my backyard fence. I told the police that those weren't our footprints, and they asked if I was sure. I confirmed I was, saying, "Why would I jump my own backyard fence?" Luckily, the police didn't find anyone hiding on my property, so they left and promised to keep me updated about the reservoir situation. To my surprise, they actually did follow up. A few days later, the police recovered 3 bodies from the reservoir, no shock there, and it became a huge news story for a while. My parents and I were terrified for months, knowing that some criminals had known where we lived. My mom even swore she saw people in the woods at night and claimed she saw a camera flash one evening. That incident was one of the main reasons we moved out of that house. Fast forward to today, and as far as I know, the police were never able to find any connection or make any arrests. I'm writing about this now because I recently stumbled upon a depressing news article about a teenager drowning in that reservoir, and it brought all these memories back. That place is definitely cursed, and I still wonder about all the tragedies that might have happened there, unknown to anyone.